Okay, well, thank you everybody again for joining. Those who just joined, welcome to our webinar. We're going to talk about the evolving state of ground stations and data. This is part of the SmallSat 2020 conference. So a little bit about RBC Signals. So we are a global space communications provider serving satellite operators in GEO, LEO, and MEO with an improved model for delivery and processing of data of satellites in orbit. Our company's worldwide network includes both company-owned and partner-owned antennas, and we capitalize on the sharing economy for best-in-class services, offering affordability, flexibility, and low latency. So a little bit about how this presentation will go. We'll do about 30 minutes of presentation followed by 25 minutes of Q&A. And just so you understand the mechanics of Q&A, there is a question field. And so if you have a question as we go through the presentation, just drop that in there. We'll be able to see those. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll go through those. So note also that this webinar is being recorded. So any questions you ask will also be recorded. So we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Unfortunately, Christopher Richens was scheduled to speak today. He is under the weather and will not be able to join us today. But presenting will be Ron Faith, President and COO of RBC Signals. He will talk to you today about planning for success, launch and operations, and future-proofing your strategy. So with that, I will turn it over to Ron and let him kick things off.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that. So as Sean said, we are going to have the following things that we're going to cover today. So first of all, we're going to cover planning for success. And so this should be all the things that you should be thinking about in preparation for your mission. Second, we're going to talk about launch and operations. And then the third area, which is always one of the more interesting areas where we get lots of questions, is in future-proofing your strategy. So what are some of the trends we're seeing and actions that we're seeing out there that satellite operators are going into directionally on things? And so to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about what is the scope of what we're going to cover today. So on any space mission, there's the following elements of the space mission. So there's launch, there's the satellite manufacturing and the operations of the satellite itself, and then there's the communications and the ground segment and mission operations that are going on the ground. It is the case in the small satellite space that we've seen dramatic change and evolution in just the last few years on what's going on. Small satellites, we believe, are truly transformative technology and capability. Similar to what we saw with hydraulics versus the steam engine, or with PCs versus mainframes, we believe that small sats land up providing a rich new capability that lands up augmenting what we've done traditionally with large geostationary satellites. And so when you're doing the mission planning and thinking of the segments, there are certain parts of it that are very sexy, get lots of attention, get lots of focus from a schedule standpoint, et cetera. And then there's other parts of it that are less sexy, and we would argue are just as important, if not more important, that you should be taking into consideration. So, so launch, for example, because of the changes in launch, such as reusable rockets and ride sharing, the cost of launch has come down significantly. The ability to put up multiple satellites on the same launch has made this a great capability, and we've seen just a huge growth in the number of small satellites that have been making it up into orbit. Then what we always see with teams is a tremendous amount of focus on the satellite itself, in particular when it comes to things such as sensors that are flying on the satellites. So these are the unique capabilities that the satellite's going up and providing unique value for the end customer to begin with. And so it makes all the sense in the world that this is where a lot of the excitement is, a lot of the differentiation from other satellite operators, et cetera. but the vast majority of the value that's being provided by these satellites, whether it's Earth observation, whether it's IoT and Internet of Things, whether it's data communications, that when we look at that, that there's data that needs to be making its way from the satellite to the ground. And so as a result, data communications and satellite communications in general will end up being absolutely critical. And if you don't solve for that, it can be the Achilles heel of the entire mission. All too often, what we see, however, is that there's a lot of focus on launch because it's very exciting. There's a lot of focus on the satellite manufacturing because of the sensors and the unique value that the satellites are providing. And all too often, as your launch date, if it holds, and your schedule is getting compressed, and you have some delays in what you're doing in the satellite manufacturing side of things, that it's the communications portion of things that can sometimes get a short shift. And that's really unfortunate. So one of the things you're going to hear throughout the course of today's presentation is the real need to prioritize your space communication strategy and your execution and your operations surrounding it, and to give it the appropriate level of priority that it deserves. When we talk about the ground segment, most of what we're going to talk about in the ground segment today has primarily do with the antennas and the stack underneath of the antennas that enable communications. We're also going to talk about the processing of the data. So one of the things that has changed and has shifted over time is because of these satellites being primarily about data services in some way, shape, or form. The need to be able to take the payload data and be able to process it effectively becomes increasingly important and is growing in size over time in terms of the sheer amount of the data workloads. So we're not going to talk as much today about mission operations from an operations control center and things of that nature, but we are going to talk about what you should be doing in comms, as well as what we would recommend that you should be doing as far as data processing and compute pipeline for dealing with things. So in planning for success, you really need to take a robust systems engineering approach. And that means coming up with the requirements and having the requirements really drive what you're doing. And because so much of the value is tied up in the data that's coming down from the satellites, that means you really need to be data-centric in how you're thinking about your architectures and your plans and how you're going to execute on things. And so, so not only do you have to think about the traditional requirements that you would have around traditional SATCOM capabilities, but you also need to be thinking about data rates and processing rates and image sizes and things of that nature, so that you can properly have an end-to-end solution that's really going to meet the end customer's needs. The other thing to be thinking about here is increasingly where traditionally a lot of the things have been done in government-oriented space or state-sponsored space activities, we're seeing a growing amount of commercial activity going on. And as a result, you really need to have a mindset that's more commercially oriented. That means think about not only the satellite operator, but also the end customer. So rather than just being focused primarily just on the nuts and bolts of the engineering of the solution, also think about what's the value that's being provided to the end customer, how is that solution ultimately being packaged, and how should you be taking those needs and requirements into account as part of your communications solution in order to meet those end customers' needs. Because at the end of the day, especially on commercially oriented things, just solving the technical problems aren't enough. You're part of a team that's also solving business problems, and you need to have a much more holistic viewpoint to how you're doing things and take a more iterative approach to solving, learning, and solving again in how you're dealing with those issues. So one of the areas that we wanted to focus on this morning is what's going on in the area of licensing and regulatory compliance. So all too often, one of the things that we see happens here is that getting the licenses for both your satellite and the ground station can land for your communications can land up being the long pole in the tent. That in many cases it can take as much as 9 months, and you should plan for it taking about 9 months in order to secure appropriate licenses for your craft. All too often, we see folks who have had their timelines compressed. They haven't appropriately steered into their licensing and regulatory issues soon enough, and they're in a mad rush with the regulators in order to try to get their license before they launch and before they get on orbit. So strongly encourage you to give yourself enough time. And again, in general, you should be thinking about 9 months in lead time associated with that. We have gotten licenses for our customers more rapidly than that at times, but you don't want to be pulling rabbits out of your hat associated with these types of things. It is also the case that, quite frankly, we're seeing the regulatory environment, especially in the US, get a little more stricter and a little more constrained. This is because NOAA and NASA have some very legitimate concerns about interference on many of their spacecraft and critical missions, in particular with NOAA and their weather satellites. Oftentimes it's not truly appreciated just how important those weather satellites are and all the different end clients there are associated with those weather satellites. It's not just what you get on the nightly news for your weather forecast. They have important missions with respect to the Department of Defense and other areas in science and operations. So with that, some of the trends that we're seeing in licensing lead us to recommend some things in these areas. So first of all, we would recommend that when you're looking at it, you should really be looking at licensed spectrum as opposed to unlicensed spectrum. The reason for that is unlicensed spectrum oftentimes is crowded and congested. So for example, we've seen some customers recently that are trying to do things, for example, in S-band in the unlicensed spectrum. And the problem with that is you're operating in the same place like Wi-Fi. And that if you want to talk about a noisy environment, all you have to do is try to have a ground station competing with Wi-Fi in your local environments from a conflicting standpoint. It's also the case that in the unlicensed spectrum, there are increasingly stringent power requirements in terms of what you're allowed to transmit in. And that makes it just very difficult to work for satellite communications because of strength of signal and the gain that you have to have and things of that nature. So one, we would discourage folks from going into unlicensed bands. We would encourage folks to be taking a hard look at S-band for uplink, where you're transmitting up to the satellite, and looking at X-band for downlink, where you're bringing data down from the satellite. And so S-band uplink and X-band downlink tends to be where the regulators would like you directionally to go into, okay? And you're going to have an easier time getting your license associated with it. It's never truly easy, and we would recommend, whether it's with ourselves or with others, that you use appropriate folks that know how to navigate the regulatory and licensing process and not try to do it yourself. Because there's some twists and turns. The other thing you really need to be doing in your applications is being consistent in your applications, and by having somebody helping you out in that process, that can be very helpful. Some of the places where we're recommending that you avoid from a spectrum standpoint today is in licensed UHF. So that's really being discouraged in general from the regulators. And now the exclusion to that is we know that in the audience today, and we love with SmallSat in general, we have a lot of university teams and CubeSat teams and things like that. We love you guys. And so operating in the amateur band in UHF is still okay. But understand what you're dealing with there associated with that. Okay, but in licensed UHF, we're really seeing folks being discouraged from going in those areas. The other area we're seeing is S-band downlink. So S-band down, we're seeing folks being discouraged from a regulatory standpoint doing that as well. Because not only are we seeing issues associated with spectrum management around not conflicting or interfering with NOAA or NASA operations, but with the advent of 5G coming along, there's shifting things going on in spectrum management there as well. And for SATCOM, we need to coexist with some of those needs and be consistent of that. One of the other areas that we strongly encourage satellite operators to do is, again, we talk about start early, but start early isn't just about licensing. It isn't just about your planning. You really need to also be putting test plans in place and, plan your work and work your plan. Right? And that's a classic old engineering adage, but it's truly the case in this instance that you really need to do that. And testing needs to be a really important and key component of that. Okay, so again, the adage of test what you fly and fly what you test is critically important here. So that means you have to have really good configuration management processes and discipline in place. So that, so first of all, do testing on the bench between the radio you're flying and the antennas you're flying on the satellites, as well as what you're doing on the ground or what you're planning on doing on the ground. And then also take test passes on the ground station itself, whether it's with an existing satellite you might have in orbit or with some other things that you might be able to loan. In terms of use or test there as well. And so that way, you cut down on the number of surprises because, space is hard. It's hard in launch. It's hard when you're on orbit and with the satellites themselves. And space communications is hard too, right? So while it's an engineering practice, oftentimes what goes on in, especially in radio frequency communications, is a little bit of a dark art at times. And you want to take out as much of the technical risk as possible. And by performing testing, it's doing that. So one of the things that, and again, I'm going to go back to this, where for your planning processes, oftentimes what you're doing for comms can land up getting compressed towards the end. Okay, and that means test plans get compressed even further. And so really give yourself some buffer to do that and make sure that you're really working with your partners end to end to have a robust and good solution for doing that. So we wanted to give you a sense for when we engage with a satellite operator, what's the satellite operator workflow on the communication side of things? What's the sequence and the order of things? And so the first thing we do, as we talked about before, is having a real requirements-driven process. So the first thing that we do in engaging with any of our customers is gather the requirements. And that means, so what orbit are you planning on being in? Right? Because we need to know the orbital mechanics. Where are you flying over top of? Are you in a sun synchronous orbit? Are you in mid-latitude orbit? Are you in LEO? Are you in MEO? Are you in GEO? Are you in a geosynchronous transfer orbit? I'll be honest with you, we're seeing it all across both of all of our customers, as well as with the RFPs and RFIs that we see coming in. And it's actually very robust in terms of the wide range of requirements that come in. And not only do you need to be thinking in terms of your comms plan for when you're on orbit and doing that steadily, you also have to think about your launch and early operations and your communications with the satellite early on, because oftentimes, where you're at in orbit associated with LEOP is different than ultimately where you're going to land up. And you need to be able to have a ground station solution and antennas that are going to support you from LEOP all the way to your final orbit for what you're planning on. Frequency bands, again, a lot of that is spectrum management, but you also need to be able to be figuring out your link budgets and realistically what frequencies you're operating in order to know your data rates, because you need to be able to meet your mission requirements for being able to get your data down within the time of your passes, right? So if you're in a low Earth orbit pass, it's not uncommon for that to be just 10 to 12 minutes of time that you're over the antenna asset. And so the question is, what do you need to accomplish in that time frame? How much data do you need to transfer during that time frame, both up and down, in order to communicate? How are you closing your link budget there from a gain factor and strength of signal and things of that nature? Also, what's your waveform look like? So what are you using from a modulation standpoint? Are you right-hand polarization, left-hand polarization, et cetera? And then, what's your plan in terms of how many passes a day do you need to be performing in order to meet your end customer's needs? And that's important because that in many ways determines, how many antennas you need and in what locations. And you need to do that for both what you're planning on doing on command and control, or TT&C, as well as what you're doing for your data downlink. Okay, so we tend to have an onboarding sheet where we interact with the satellite operator, let them know all of the requirements that we need in order to help putting together a plan where we can then select and certify which antennas in our network could fulfill their needs. And then once we've been able to select and certify which antennas and the radios and everything else at that site would do the trick for the customer, we then land up going through a regulatory process for making sure that those customers are appropriately licensed in those locations. And you have to do that in the geography in which the ground stations are located. And so we have a great team that's able to do that all over the world. You'll see in a moment all the ground stations that we've dealt with in all the different localities and local regulatory bodies that you have to deal with in order to do that. Then you're in good shape for how you're doing end-to-end systems integration and how you're interfacing. So that's not only how are you talking with the satellite, both up and down in terms of your plans, but also how are you dealing with mission control, right? So we'll end up exposing a bunch of web services APIs that the Missions Operations Center is able to interact with. And we'll go in detail a little later about how that interaction happens, but you want to make sure that's working, and so that you do all the software integration necessary to do the back and forth between ourselves or any other ground station as a service provider, and then have that work with ultimately with your mission associated with it. And also what you're doing in terms of security, and we're going to talk about cybersecurity a little later. But what you need there in terms of encryption and how things are being passed, et cetera. We then perform site preparation, and then you segue into operations. So to give you a feel for what's happening, so we're seeing a big shift from the traditional model of you build a ground station, and that is purpose built or bespoke for a given mission. And so the economics of that are challenging, and that's why traditionally it's been state-sponsored entities that have done it that way. You also get low utilization rates oftentimes, whether when the mission's completed or things of that nature. So what we've done and what we've seen as a general shift in the marketplace is really going to a model called ground stations as a service. And that's where there's a worldwide network of ground stations that are available, and you're able to select and get licensed for ground stations that fit the needs of your mission. And these are multi-mission ground stations, so that you're sharing those ground stations as an asset with others, okay? In our particular network, we land up having everything from VHF and UHF through SC, X, and X band, all the way up through KA and KU. And we've even deployed our first optical ground station associated with that, and we'll talk about optical comms a little later. That in order to do this at scale, you need to have common interfaces for how you're dealing with the customers. So we have an API-based web services API that we expose to the customers to enable that to use that. We have now close to 80 antennas in over 50 locations around the world that can support a wide variety of orbits and a wide variety of missions associated with that. And so that allows us to mix and match and find different options for customers, especially if they land up being sensitive for where data might be landing. So some international customers don't necessarily want their data landing on US soil, and vice versa for certain geographies around the world. Some places are more challenging to license for certain operators than others. And so you want to have flexibility and capabilities there. And we're able to provide that flexibility because of the close to 80 antennas in over 50 locations, it's actually a hybrid network where we have both partner-owned antennas, and we're going to talk about how if you're a ground station partner out there and you'd like to join the network, we'd love to talk with you about it, as well as RBC Signals owned assets that for particular reasons we're able to provide higher level SLAs or priorities or in particular certain cybersecurity requirements for particular customers. And this network is used by not only commercial operators, but by government operators as well, such as the DoD and intelligence community and civilian government as well. So what also happens in ground station as a service, rather than the traditional CapEx model where you spend $500,000 to $1 million building a big ground station asset at the high end, and you got to come up with all that money to do that. This is much more aligned with what you're seeing in the cloud today for cloud services around compute and storage and things of that nature, so that you're able to have a subscription service as well as be able to utilize it by the drink. And so we have two flavors of that. One is core, where you can always have the highest guarantee on a particular antenna asset. So you can know that you're never bumped from a priority standpoint on that. So you never have to worry about contention, and you pay a monthly fee in order to have that priority. And then there's our network, where you can intermittently use as you need burstable capability, whether you need more passes one month or less passes the next month, et cetera. And we often see with our customers go to a mixed model on this, where they'll have one or two antennas that they're subscribing to as a core, and then the rest of the antennas they're using for extra capacity on a network basis. And then from a system standpoint, how it works is we have a software system that stitches it all together that we call ROS, not to be confused with characters from Friends or anything of that nature. And so basically what we're doing is with our ground station partners, we're getting from them what's all the available excess capacity they have on their ground station in terms of available times. We're then also getting the information from the satellite operator in terms of their TLEs and certain specific things about the satellite itself in terms of radio frequencies, modulations, et cetera. We're then performing the orbital calculations and then figuring out what links are available, what time slots are available, and make that available to the end customer and the satellite mission control. They then select which ones they want. They book it through our web services API. And then we then confirm that order with the ground station operator and reserve that with them, and then perform it when the time comes in order to do that. We then provide all of the data associated with the pass, as well as the payloads and everything else gets transferred back all the way through to the satellite mission control operator. And then we're taking care of all of the metering and billing and everything else that's going on behind the scenes, and doing the revenue share with the ground station partner. Okay, so in terms of the future of what we're seeing, so one, we're continuing to see this shift to ground stations as a service. And we think that's a long-term trend. It's become a long-term trend in traditional compute and storage and things like that with the cloud operators. And we're seeing it happen with the ground station as well. And that there's a lot of great learnings to get from that. So when you're doing that, you get better economics at scale. You end up getting greater flexibility and choice of research of assets and where they're located around the world. It also means that what you're doing is rather than a mission-specific ground station, you have to be dynamic in being able to reconfigure that ground station to be able to work for multiple customers. And so that means you're really moving towards software-defined ground stations, where you want things like software-defined radios to the degree that's possible. You want to be interfacing with the ACU for the grounds, the antenna control unit, in order to do the positioning and things of that nature, and the tracking associated with it. And then you also need flexible compute and storage capabilities at the ground station as well. We're going to go in that in a little more detail momentarily. The final thing that I really wanted to talk about in this area in terms of big shifts in just the last few years is a recognition of increased importance of cybersecurity. We're seeing that not only with our defense and government customers, we're seeing it on the commercial side as well. And so there are certain frameworks that we've adopted and that we would encourage everyone else to adopt as well on the ground station side, especially as it's become more data-centric and data valued in what people are doing. So with respect to that, there's a new framework that's being rolled out for government customers by the end of this year called CMMC. And that builds on top of the traditional NIST cybersecurity standards. And we've adopted those, and we would strongly encourage anybody on the call today to take a hard look at the NIST cybersecurity standards associated with in general data services, but in particular for satellite operations. And the reason why it's important is clearly you don't want anybody messing with the command and control of your satellite, but you also want to make sure that there's integrity associated with your data payloads and the chain of command and ownership associated with the data that's coming off your satellites and how that's transferring to folks. One of the other big changes that we're seeing over time is the increased demand for higher data rates. And so this is because the sensors that are flying on the satellites are becoming more higher resolution. The satellites themselves are becoming more complex. And so as a result, they themselves are IoT devices throwing off a lot of data about their own operations and health and things along those lines. And then we're also seeing satellites being used as IoT gateways for communications and things of that nature. So as a result, for a desire to go to higher and higher data rates, it kind of feels like in the early days of the internet, where you had dial-up internet with 9600 baud modems and 14400 baud modems to eventually getting to Ethernet. And so, so some of the traditional lower frequency RF, we're seeing more capabilities for going to higher frequency bands, especially in Ka and Ku, because that allows you to get higher data rates. We're also seeing a great deal of interest in phased array antennas so that you might be able to support multiple satellites in the same pass, multi-beam capabilities, things along those lines. And finally, a little bit of the holy grail in this area is in optical comms, okay? And so we're seeing a lot of interest and growth in inter-satellite links in optical comms, because in free space, optical, you can have very high data rates. In fact, theoretically, it can be as good or better than what you have in fiber and glass in the ground. But then optical has challenges from space to ground because of scattering and weather conditions and things of that nature. But we're seeing increased interest there. We've deployed our first optical ground station. And one of the other areas that we're seeing a great deal of interest in optical is in lunar missions and increased interest in cislunar. Okay. One of the other areas here to talk about is how in a data-centric architecture, you really need to be thinking more about distributed computing architectures. And what we mean by that is today, not only do you have cloud compute, which gets used extensively, but you'll hear a lot about edge computing being in greater and greater demand, so that you want to have compute as close to the edge as possible for low latency applications and being able to process data quickly and be able to get it to the end user quickly associated with that. We're seeing both in our DoD customers and in commercial customers an increased desire to move data and move processing as much to the edge as possible, where some of the ultimate goal is to do onboard processing on the satellite more and more extensively. There are some challenges in what you can do there because of thermal regulation and size and weight and things of that nature, but we're bullish on the idea that there's going to be more and more onboard processing going on. There's increasing use of cloud compute capability on the back end. And so, for example, whether that's with AWS or Microsoft Azure, we see more and more utilization of that when a lot of the software stacks that are being written are utilizing those cloud stacks in terms of from operating system and middle tier and other platform as a service capabilities. But the terrestrial edge of where processing can go on, and we see this in our customers as well, is actually at the ground station as well, where we're seeing initially it looks like virtual servers that are running some of the image processing stack or data processing stack. As soon as the data hits the ground, you're able to do that very quickly. You're able to create metadata products or prioritize or cull the data for what you ultimately want to push to an analyst or the end user back in a cloud or a data center, and then be able to more effectively use backhaul between the edge ground station and wherever you're doing your cloud compute capabilities. Because some of these places are very remote, North Slope of Alaska, et cetera, and you have to be mindful of what you're utilizing there. And finally, one of the things I wanted to cover was if you are a ground station owner out there and you have excess capacity because either the missions you've supported have come to an end, or we oftentimes see that mission may only be using single-digit percentage of the available time in a given day, and you would like to earn extra money in order to offset your operation costs and things of that nature, please come and talk to us. We are constantly adding partners. We have very high quality partners in our network, such as, for example, the Indian Space Agency. ISRO is a partner of ours. AWS Ground is a partner of ours. And we're able to support every geography, but we're always looking for new partners and new capabilities in order to provide more robust options to our end customers. In particular, we're looking at UHF, S and X and KA. So please, if you have those, come to us. It is also the case that for teleport operators, we oftentimes look to place antennas for our customers in locations. And so if you have excess space and great infrastructure, especially broadband infrastructure on the back end, we're always happy to talk about that for antenna hosting as well. And our model for how this works is a revenue share model, where basically whatever we're getting from the end customer, we're doing a revenue share with you, and that's all found in new revenue for you as a ground station partner. Okay. So with that, we're going to open up to Q&A.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ron. was a great overview. So why don't we pause for about a minute and we'll let Ron catch his breath, and we will let you place your questions into Q&A, and we'll just come back in a minute or two. Okay, so we have quite a list of questions here to get to. If for whatever reason we don't get to your question, we will have a follow-up email with the recording, and there'll be another opportunity we can interact directly on some of the longer questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Ron to address the questions.
Thank you, Sean. So, so the first question is, what are we seeing in terms of Ka-band and LEO for ground stations, and what do we think the demand looks like going forward, et cetera? So the largest demand in Ka-band right now is with the mega constellations, quite frankly. So whether that looks like, let me just, there we go. We'll turn on video so you guys can see me while I'm answering these questions. So, so one is that, you know, whether it's Starlink from SpaceX, whether it's OneWeb, many of these mega constellations are operating in Ka-band, and as a result, that's where we're seeing the greatest amount of demand for ground stations associated with that. And they're all in the process of building those out dramatically. We think there'll be a little bit of a lag in terms of broad availability of Ka-band assets, because most of those Ka-band assets today are really dedicated for those mega constellations and haven't been made available more generally to other satellite operators. And so that's going to be a challenge in the near term. We see, especially for getting data to the ground, the best and widest amount of inventory is an X-band downlink. And we'd encourage you to go in that direction for right now. Next question is, you know, how can we connect with you? Please go to our website, which is at www.rbcsignals.com. On there, you'll find a form to reach out and connect with us, and we will be happy to follow up with you and talk with you about things associated with that. The next question was, will the recording of this webinar be available? It is our intent to do that. So we will end up be doing that. Give us a few days, and then we should be able to post the recording of this and make that available more broadly. And when we do so, it'll be our intent to mail everyone that is registered for the session so that you know it's up and available for you. Okay. Please explain the importance or the extent of guidance required for frequency licensing procedure. It is hard for me not to overstate just how important this is. Okay, so again, start the process early. Use folks that have experience in the area and have done it before. And plan that there will be potentially twists and turns along the way. You know, and then, you know, one of the things that we always do in the process is we have very good relationships with the regulators. And quite frankly, we ask for guidance from the regulators in all sorts of different situations associated with it. We also have great partners in this area. You know, we've folks such as, you know, SmallSat, if you're looking for licensing, you know, different places around the world, they have great capabilities in that area, and we interact and work with them quite a bit as well. So the next question is, does RBC Signals have any capability or plans to bring up capabilities for deep space applications? So this is a question that is near and dear to our founder's heart. So the answer to that is yes. And so with that said, there's all sorts of challenges that go with deep space applications that are different than, let's say, LEO applications or things like that. We're seeing a lot of demand, in particular in cislunar right now. And so we're addressing a lot of those issues for solving those problems for cislunar customers. In fact, one of the optical you know, partners we're dealing with is in one of those areas. But we are also dealing with things with deep space. And in particular, a lot of things we're seeing going on in deep space has to do with the strategy side of things. What's the communication strategy? What are the assets that are available and they want to utilize? And how do you get there from here? So if you do have a deep space mission and you're looking for advice and counsel, we are more than happy to talk with you about that. And if we can help you, we'll steer you in directions of folks who can. Okay. So what are our recommendations for new university satellite operators and designers? Any common mistakes to avoid? That's a loaded question. So as you can imagine, with university satellite operators and in particular the CubeSat teams, they're doing it in large part because they want to learn, and learning means failing and learning from those mistakes and correcting those mistakes and making things work properly. So in particular, when it comes to your communication strategy, I'd strongly encourage you to not try to figure it all out on your own, and not just rely on something like Wikipedia to get there from here. But to engage with experts in the field. I think you will find many of us happy to give advice and counsel along the way to avoid some common mistakes. Oftentimes what we see as part of a learning exercise, a university team will build their own antenna and their own ground station from scratch. And they learn a lot of hard lessons that way. And for, you know, old hats such as ourselves, we're more than happy to provide some advice and counsel. It is also the case that for university satellite operators that they may have a single point of failure in their home-built ground station. And so it's important to have some backup or resiliency from whether it's ourselves or other ground station as a service partners out there, that in the event that you have problems or difficulties with your primary ground station, that you can fall back on somebody else that can help you troubleshoot problems and deal with that. So hopefully that answers the question there. Let's see, next question is, what advice would you give planning your mission operations once CubeSat is live? Okay, so one of the questions is, what advice would you have to plan out your mission operations once your CubeSat is live? A great question. One of the things is that you really want to understand, you know, so one is you want to know the health of your satellite pretty well. So early on, what you're doing in LEOP might be different than what you're doing on day-to-day in terms of mission ops. And that impacts what you're doing for TT&C and your communications there. So you may be taking a large number of passes early on in order to have good, robust communications, and then shifting that to fewer passes later. But early on, you really want to have as many passes as possible. And you know, when I say as many passes as possible, it's really healthy to have anything anywhere from 5 to 10 you know, passes to be able to support that in a given day, so that you can have good, robust interactions with your satellite as it's in the early phases and you're interacting with that. Because you're really troubleshooting, working a bunch of things out, especially in the early days of the satellite. There are things that will go wrong. There are things that you can correct. And the other things you want to do is when you bring your satellite up, it's so exciting that you're just kind of rushing through your checklist and trying to get the satellite as operational as quickly as possible. Really encourage you to take your time, be methodical, step by step, get one system up and running and confirm that that's the case and you're in good health, and then move to the next step. Okay. You're going to be, because, you know, again, with university CubeSat teams, we see it all the time where it's very exciting. You know, there's a mad rush, there's adrenaline pumping through everybody's veins. But understand, get it on orbit and healthy, and then you can perform all the things that you've been planning for in the months leading up to the launch associated with that. Questions about talking a little bit more about our optical ground stations and what they look like and what capabilities that they have. So the interesting thing about optical ground stations is that, one, they're not like a traditional RF antenna, right, with a big dish and things like that. You really, you know, essentially have a telescope on the ground that is pointing and tracking an object in space. So first of all, what we're seeing most space to ground applications in optical ground is primarily receive only initially. And that's because transmit from ground to satellite, you really have to worry about commercial aviation. You don't want lasers landing up, impacting commercial aircraft, things of that nature. So you're really looking at downlinks, and that's where the primary value is in terms of the higher data rates and getting it down. You want to have a really fine-tuned positioner that can track really well, because your pointing requirements on an optical ground station can oftentimes be higher than in a traditional RF environment. So you want to be careful of that. And you also want to make sure that you are dealing in frequency ranges and that you're not going to have a lot of problems. You also want your mission ops so that you're not trying to do optical comms where the satellite is immediately in the same location as the sun, and therefore your optical sensors are getting swamped when you're communicating with that. I'd also encourage you, we've located ours in a very nice weather place where it is sunny, I think over 95% of the time, and you don't get a big marine layer and things like that in. And so you also want to have it in a location, you know, high deserts that don't get a lot of rain and things like that tend to be good locations for your optical ground stations as well. So another question is that we mentioned software-defined radio-based stations. Are we looking to partner with more with receiving stations and ones that do both? The answer is yes, right? So oftentimes when it comes to the SDRs, we're looking at both capabilities first and foremost in terms of does it meet the requirements of the satellite operator and the mission, and compatibility. Especially for the waveforms that need to be supported, et cetera. But then we're also sensitive to cost, quite frankly, right? And so, you know, what works for a university CubeSat mission in terms of cost looks different than what looks than for an Air Force mission. And so, you know, we, as a result, we have a wide range of SDR partners today that go all the way up from military grade SDRs for can't fail kind of missions, all the way down to SmallSat missions that are test and demonstration, where cost and price is an issue, and supporting those. So that's the answer there. Another question is, in what locations are we looking for more capacity? So one is, we've done very well in the Northern Hemisphere. We would be happy to augment more and more of our capabilities in the Southern Hemisphere, with things such as that, and we are seeing more demand in that area. So if you are a ground station partner in the Southern Hemisphere, we'd love to talk with you about that. And also, basically for sun synchronous orbits, we're looking to get as far north and as far south as possible, and on opposite sides of the poles, so that we can support many, many passes. And we do that today in the Arctic, between what we can do on the North Slope of Alaska and what we can do in Northern Europe. And we'd like to have more and more capability in the Southern Hemisphere to be able to do that today. And with that, we've got time for 2 more questions. So in the next 5 years, where do you see the biggest growth for your ground station service coming from? Whether it's comms, Earth observation, remote sensing, IoT, other things, right? So, so a few things in that. So first of all, we see a lot of the growth in our ground stations, not only in the utilization of the ground stations, because the sheer amount of satellites that are planned to go up over the next 5 years is dramatic. And they are across the board. They are comms, they are Earth observation, they are IoT, they're in specialty areas around weather satellites and sensors, et cetera. So we not only see huge demand across the board for small sats in general, but one of the areas we're most excited about is actually in the value-added data services that's going to come from those that can come from the terrestrial edge. And that means doing the data processing, not only on board the satellite, but also at the ground station itself, and having a robust relationship with the cloud compute capabilities on the back end. So whether that looks like, us, we have the ability to put Microsoft Azure Stack, as well as AWS outposts in our ground stations, and make those available as part of a continuous distributed cloud architecture for any customer that wants to do that. But we see that as an increasing amount of growth, just as we've seen happen in other applications on the ground with respect to what growth has happened in cloud data centers and the value-added services that grow from that. Let's see. I apologize that we are getting more questions that we can answer, but I'll address one more. So one question is, what makes you different from AWS ground station service, and how do you plan to compete with it? So the first thing that I'd love to say is AWS ground station is actually a partner of ours. And so AWS ground stations are available in our network. We work with them very closely. We've got good overlap in terms of both our government customers as well as our commercial customers, and we enjoy working with them. So, it can be a co-opetition situation. And so if a customer just wants to be able to talk to an AWS ground station site and in very low latency be able to get their data processed from that antenna to the AWS grounds, the data center that ground station is co-located with, then they're able to do that. But it's the case with AWS ground, and I'm sure they're comfortable with me saying this, that most of the ground stations that they've built out are co-located with their data centers, and as a result, they're in a lot of mid-latitude locations. And so that means we'll end up augmenting or complementing their existing ground stations as they build it out, especially for sun synchronous orbit missions, where customers may want to have a location like on the North Slope of Alaska or something of that nature. And so that's where an AWS ground and ourselves really work well together. We bring customers to them and vice versa. And so we're Very happy partners with them. It is also the case that, you know, we're a strategic partner with them on the data processing side as well. So just as we have a very good relationship with Microsoft associated with their capabilities in Azure and Azure Stack, we have a similar relationship with AWS. So with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Sean. If I didn't get to your questions, I apologize in advance right now. But thank you very much for attending our session today. Please take advantage of all the other SmallSat conference sessions and things like that as well. We're a huge supporter of SmallSat. We love you guys, and hopefully we will all see each other in Logan, Utah next year.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ron. Okay, well, this concludes our webinar on the evolving state of ground stations and data. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As Ron mentioned, we will have the recording available in the next few days, so you can watch that. And again, if you didn't get your question answered and would like it answered, you can go to the website, as Ron mentioned, to the contact form, or you can email us directly at info@rbcsignals.com, and we'd be happy to connect with you, and we can even set up meetings. So enjoy the rest of virtual SmallSat. We miss seeing everybody in person, and hopefully we look forward to seeing everybody next year. Thanks.